Member.
I want to start by acknowledging that we are here today, as every day, in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation.
Now we're debating the new NAFTA, and as the Green Party, this is an improvement. Unlike the first versions of NAFTA, they eliminated in the new NAFTA Chapter 11, which casts a shadow on our laws here in Canada in favor of large corporations in the U.S. And it also hindered our environment and our health. Also, the energy chapter will be cancelled when the new NAFTA will come into force. These are good news for us because Canada is the only country in NAFTA that has the obligation to respect export levels, knowing that this will undermine our own energy security.
That have been made are something of a surprise given the history of trade agreements. I've long been an opponent of trade agreements that put corporate profits above sustainability, above community health and prosperity and well-being. It's actually the case that this agreement, this CUSMA, is the first time, certainly in recent decades, that any trade agreement represents an improvement over what had preceded it in giving us more clout in protecting the environment and reduce the corporate powers that have been expanding ever since the neoliberal era began. In fact, it was in the first NAFTA that the notion of investor-state dispute resolutions gained traction, particularly in the developed world. And my colleague, the member for Nanaimo Ladysmith, has already spoken to this and provided some details about investor-state agreements. Permit me to just add a little bit more personal detail. Before ever being involved in politics, I was always involved in the environmental movement, whether as a lawyer or in government or with environmental groups. And as executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, we ran straight into the very first applications of Chapter 11. When NAFTA was being debated within Canada, the pernicious anti-democratic impacts of Chapter 11 were unknown. We debated many things about NAFTA in this country, but no one talked about investor-state provisions. It was something of a sleeper in the first version of NAFTA. Well, we woke up to that sleeper when we finally succeeded. So I was involved in a citizens' campaign to try to get rid of a toxic gasoline additive in this country called MMT, based in manganese. I worked with neurotoxicologists from Montreal, particularly Dr. Donna Mergler from UQAM. Worked with, believe it or not, Sierra Club worked with the car manufacturers because this MMT as a gasoline additive gummed up the onboard diagnostics in the car so that they were violating, potentially violating warranties. So it was the first time you have a coalition, if you can imagine, of environmental groups and car makers and scientists all saying this toxic gasoline additive has to be removed. The Minister of Environment at the time acted. That was Sheila Copps. We managed to get rid of this toxic gasoline additive, only to have Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia, bring a suit against Canada. We were shocked by this. It was the first Chapter 11 challenge. And in a secret tribunal, they made the case that this was going to cost them money. I think it's important for members of Parliament to understand how important it is that we get rid of these provisions in every other trade agreement. They need not say that the actions Canada took, taken by former Environment Minister Sheila Copps, were in any way in objection to trade. They were not hidden, veiled protectionist measures. They were what they said they were. Getting something that was bad for human health, compromised the onboard diagnostics to ensure that pollution was controlled by the engine itself. All of these things were caused by MMT. There was no doubt about that. But The government at the time, under former Prime Minister Chrétien, decided to settle with Ethel Corp, fearing the worst out of the secret tribunal. We actually had to pay, as a country, taken out of the A-based budget of Environment Canada, millions of dollars to Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia. We had to repeal the law we passed to keep this stuff out of our environment. And, on top of everything else, we wrote a formal letter of apology that Ethel Corporation could use around the world to peddle this toxic stuff in other countries. There are many more cases like this. There's S.D. Myers of Ohio challenging a decision to stop the export of PCB-contaminated waste. Probably the worst of all of them is the most recent, is Bilcon, where they brought a U.S. corporation brought charges against Canada for the proper use of our environmental assessment law, properly applied the version that occurred before the 2012 demolition of environmental assessment in this country, which is still not repaired, and was able to claim that the environmental assessment panel had not been fair to this company, that would have absolutely threatened the survival of one of the world's most endangered whales, the right whales of Atlantic Canada. I could go on, and I need to move to other sections of this agreement, but it's very important that we understand the difference between, and I've noticed some speakers through this debate have mistaken Chapter 19, the dispute resolution portions that we are pleased to see remain, and Chapter 11, a resolution of disputes between two parties who should never have the right to challenge each other. That a private corporation that's in the United States, under Chapter 11 of our current NAFTA, has superior powers and rights to a Canadian domestic corporation. Now, that's still the case in the countries we deal with TPP. We put investor state in there. It's horrifically the case with the Canada-China Investment Treaty that the Harper cabinet passed in secret and never even came to this place, that still binds this country to allow state-owned enterprises of the People's Republic of China to secretly sue this government if we do anything that gets in the way of their profits. That's a legacy from the Conservatives that they don't seem to know about. We have seen such damage from investor state provisions, we need to track them down and remove them wherever they are. This version, CUSMA, is a huge improvement and sets the pace for getting rid of them elsewhere. I'm also really pleased to see the end of the energy security chapter. This was really strange. Mexico had no corresponding provision in their requirements to the United States. Only Canada made a commitment that if we were to that we would not restrict exports of any of our energy exports beyond the proportion that we'd been selling to the United States over a period of time. So if we were selling 60% of our natural gas to the United States, we'd have to continue to do that under the current provisions, which will be gone with CUSMA. Even if we were running out of natural gas, we'd still have to export 60% to the United States. Very strange provisions. We're glad they're gone. I want to turn to three areas that probably haven't gotten very much attention in this debate. One is the improvements in the environment chapter, and although not as strong as what was promised by the Liberals, we certainly have stronger language, and for the first time, any component of NAFTA dealing with gender rights and Indigenous issues. On the environment chapter, I'm really pleased that we withstood efforts by Donald Trump to eliminate something that many members in this place may not have known of at all, which is the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation.
It's a commission that was regulated by three ministers of environment from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and they worked together for the protection of our environment in all these countries. And there was a very interesting provision that gave every U.S., Canadian, or Mexican citizen the right to challenge a decision that could harm the environment.
Or NGO, Canada, U.S., or Mexico, can bring a complaint to the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation to say our government is reducing environmental protections because it wants to promote trade. It's now protected and it's better funded. In the 30 seconds remaining, I want to really underscore that although it's not everything we wanted, I'm pleased that Indigenous handcrafted products can now be duty-free. I'm pleased that various Indigenous provisions of this agreement highlight the importance of Indigenous people throughout Canada, U.S., and Mexico. And finally, that there is at least some language that the goals of all of our trade agreements and multilateral cooperation have to focus on the rights of women and girls. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires?